Welcome to 1-1, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about identifying properties. Our learning objectives for this lesson will be the ability to identify the commutative, associative, inverse, and identity properties of addition and multiplication for rational numbers. Here's our introductory problem for this lesson. Go ahead and pause the video, read it, and then make sure you understand what it's asking for before moving on to the next slide. So what we're going to be talking about are all of these addition and multiplication properties. To start out with, we have the commutative property of addition. Now that states that numbers that are being added together can be added in any order. So if we've got the addition one over here, if I've got 4 plus 5, that would be the same as doing 5 plus 4. Okay, so commutative property of addition. That also works with multiplication. I could have the commutative property of multiplication saying that if I'm multiplying two numbers together, I can multiply them in any order. So if I have 4 times 5 now, that would be the same as doing 5 times 4. Our next property is the associative property. The associative property of addition states that if I'm adding more than two numbers together, I can group them any way that I want to, and that doesn't matter. So if I've got 3 plus 4 plus 5, and I want to group 3 and 4 together, I can do that. Or, if I've got 3 plus 4 plus 5, I can group 4 and 5 together. So as long as it's the same numbers being added together, I can group either one of them up. Same with multiplication. So the associative property of multiplication says that, again, with more than two numbers, so I'll bring back my 3 times 4 times 5. Okay, if I want to group two of them together, I can. If I want to group 3 and 4 together, that's fine. Or if I want to group 4 and 5 together, I still get the same answer. The last one for this slide is the inverse property of addition. So if I take a number and I add its opposite or its additive inverse, the sum that I get is 0. To find the additive inverse, I change the sign. So if I was looking for the additive inverse of 5, it's a positive 5, so the additive inverse would be negative 5. If we add those two together, I would get 0. So now if I had a negative number like negative 3, the additive inverse of negative 3, if it's negative 3, it would be positive 3. And if I add those together, I would get 0. There's also an inverse property of multiplication, but it works a little bit differently. So now if I take a number and multiply it by its reciprocal, or its multiplicative inverse, the product is 1. You can find the reciprocal of a fraction by flipping it. So that's easy when the number you're given is a fraction. So if I'm looking for the reciprocal of 3/2, I flip the fraction and make it 2/3. Multiply those together and I get 1. But what happens when it's not in a fraction? Let's say it's a 4. What's the multiplicative inverse of 4? Well, you can imagine 4 as being a fraction of 4 over 1. So if I flip that, I would get 1 over 4. And now I multiply those two together and I get my 1. Our next property is the identity property of addition. And that states that when a 0 is added to any number, the sum is that number. Yeah, so that seems like a no-brainer property, but it still needs to be put in here. So if I've got a number 6 here, and I add 0 to that, I'm going to get the number that I started with. Similarly, the identity property of multiplication says that if I take a number and I multiply it by 1, I get the same number back. So I bring back that 6, but now I want to use the identity property of multiplication, multiply it by 1, and I get that 6 back. So the next thing we're going to need to do is be able to identify the property that's being used in each equation. So there's 4 of them here. Pause the video, get an answer for all of these by stating what property they're using here, and then once you're done, go ahead and hit play to see how you did. Okay, so here are the answers. Let's see how you did. For the first one, looks like we've got negative 159 plus 0 is equal to negative 159. Since we're adding 0 to a number and getting the same number back, that's the identity property of addition. In part B, we've got three numbers being added together, 0.3, 1.2, and 0.8. And if you'll notice, in the first part of the equation, 0.3 and 1.2 are put together. And in the second part, 1.2 and 0.8 are being grouped together. So that's the associative property of addition. In the third one, we've got 8 times 3/4 is equal to 3/4 times 8. So we're changing the order that they're being multiplied, so that is the commutative property of multiplication. And in the last example, we've got 6 times 1/6 is equal to 1. So we're multiplying our number by something to give us 1. That is the inverse property of multiplication. Here is the answer to our introductory problem at the beginning of the lesson. Go ahead and make sure you read through it and see if you did it correctly or not. To finish off this lesson, just a review of all of the properties that we covered today. Make sure you've got these written down somewhere so that you can go back and use them in the future.